The fine red dust of Redemption, Texas, coated every surface like rust, a permanent stain on a town clinging to the edge of nowhere. It settled in the lines on Caleb Thorne's face as he stood before the teller's cage at the Redemption Bank and trussed his hat held tight in his hands. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper-oiled steel and the faint, cloying scent of failure. For Caleb, that smell was as familiar as his own skin. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne," said the teller, a man named Abernathy, whose spectacles couldn't hide the pity in his eyes. "Mr. Davies reviewed your account. Given the drought and last year's losses, a further loan is just not possible." The words were a hammer blow, striking the last nail into the coffin of his hope. Caleb's shoulders, broad as an axe handle, slumped. He had ridden into town on a prayer, the last of his pride, bundled up with the loan application. His ranch, the land his father had bled for, was dying of thirst. The cattle were thin and their hides stretched tight over bone, and the creek bed was a cracked, sun-baked scar. This loan was his last chance. He was about to turn to walk back out into the punishing glare of the sun and accept his defeat when the front doors of the bank burst open. Chaos erupted. Two men, their faces hidden by dusty bandanas, stormed in their movements, sharp and professional. A third, taller man followed his steps, measured and calm. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't need to. His authority was a physical presence in the room, a chilling aura that silenced the panicked gasps of the customers. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept across the room, missing nothing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the leader said, his voice surprisingly cultured, a stark contrast to the brutal efficiency of his men. "This is a withdrawal. Please cooperate, and your only loss will be a few minutes of your day." One of the masked men vaulted over the counter, his revolver pointed squarely at Abernathy's chest. The other herded the handful of customers, Caleb among them, against the far wall. The leader remained by the door, a silent, observing predator. Caleb's mind was a maelstrom of failure and fury. He had lost everything, and now he was to be a witness to this violation, a final humiliation. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to be invisible, his hand instinctively going to the small, hard object in his breast pocket. The man behind the counter worked fast, stuffing bills into a canvas sack. The robbery was almost over, a clean, swift operation. But then the leader's gaze fell on Caleb. He walked forward, his boot heels clicking on the tile floor, an unnervingly deliberate sound. He stopped directly in front of Caleb, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "You're Caleb Thorne," he said. It wasn't a question. Caleb's blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the man, but the man knew him. He gave a curt, jerky nod. The leader's gaze dropped to Caleb's chest, to the slight bulge in his pocket. "What's that?" Before Caleb could answer, the man's hand shot out quick as a snake. He pulled the object from Caleb's pocket. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. The leader's thumb pressed the catch. It sprang open, revealing a tiny, hand-tinted photograph of a smiling young woman with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and eyes that held the same fierce hope that Caleb had long since lost. Sarah. A strange stillness came over the man. He stared at the picture, his cold expression melting into something complex and unreadable, a ghost of recognition, a shadow of pain. The moment stretched, the sounds of the robbery fading into the background. "Where did you get this?" the leader whispered, his voice a raw, tight thing. "It was my wife's," Caleb rasped, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears. A sudden, desperate courage surged through him. He didn't care about the bank's money. He didn't even care about the ranch in that moment. But he would not lose this. Give it back. The leader's eyes snapped up from the photo, the brief flicker of emotion gone, replaced by an ice colder than before. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat. He looked from the picture to Caleb's face, a cruel, knowing smile twisting his lips. And you're still here, on her land. He snapped the locket shut. Then, with a sudden, brutal movement, he swung the butt of his pistol, catching Caleb squarely on the temple. Light exploded behind Caleb's eyes, a universe of white-hot stars. The hard tile floor rushed up to meet him. As consciousness bled away, his last coherent thought was not of his failing ranch or the armed men in the room. It was of his wife's face, her smile now a captive, in the hands of a cold-eyed stranger who knew his name. He lay on the floor of the bank defeated and broke in the memory of her now a stolen thing. The ranch was a place where life had stopped. It wasn't just the parched land or the skeletal remains of the creek. The silence had weight pressing down on the small, weathered, clapboard house, seeping through the walls and settling like a shroud over everything within. Caleb Thorne had carefully preserved this silence for a year, a monument to his dead wife. It was the silence of grief, sharp and sterile. He moved through his days like a ghost in his own life, the world outside him muted and gray. His face carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that clawed at the sky behind him was a map of unspoken sorrows. After the robbery, the silence had become heavier, more oppressive. He would stand before the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the empty space where Sarah's portrait used to be. He had taken it down after her funeral, unable to bear the sight of her vibrant life, captured in a frame while his own felt so empty. Now another piece of her was gone, torn from him. The locket. He could still feel the phantom weight of it in his pocket, a constant aching void. Sheriff Miller had offered his sympathies and little else. Professionals Caleb, he'd said, his voice weary, long gone by the time the dust settled. You're lucky to be alive. But Caleb didn't feel lucky. He felt hollowed out. His world had shrunk to two things, the suffocating grief for his wife and the gnawing anxiety over his 6-year-old daughter, Rose. She was a ghost in faded calico, a smaller, more fragile version of his own despair. With hair the color of dried straw and eyes that held the same winter storm as her father's. She moved through the house like a phantom. A year had passed since her mother's funeral, a year in which her voice had withered and died. She hadn't spoken a single word since the day they lowered Sarah into the hard, unforgiving earth. She was a living testament to his failure, a constant reminder of the warmth and laughter his home had lost. He saw Sarah in her eyes and the tilt of her head, and the pain of it was a knife twisting in his gut. He didn't know how to reach her, how to bridge the silent chasm that had opened between them. His helplessness was a physical weight. The ranch was failing and the locket was gone, and his daughter was lost in a world of silence he couldn't penetrate. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crumble not from a single blow, but from the relentless pressure of slow decay. He needed help. The realization came to him one evening as he watched Rose listlessly push a piece of dry bread around her plate. The house was not dirty, but it was sterile, a home embalmed in memory. It needed more than just a woman's touch. It needed the breath of life forced back into its lungs. It needed a presence that wasn't haunted by the past. The next day, he rode into redemption, his purpose as grim and practical as a nail being hammered into a board. He didn't go to the saloon to ask around, nor the church. He went to the small, dusty office of Mr. Henderson and the agent for the railroad company, the man who handled the affairs of the Chinese laborers who had laid the tracks and were now largely forgotten. He needed a housekeeper, a pair of hands to scour the grief from his silent ranch. And he needed someone who would not ask questions, someone who understood desperation, someone who had no other choice. In the dusty, unforgiving town of Redemption, Mai was an outcast, a whisper of the Orient, in a world of stark prairie whites and browns. She stood before Caleb Thorne, clutching the small, trembling hand of her daughter Ann Lee, and met his gaze. Her husband's bones lay somewhere along the iron tracks that had brought them to this land of broken promises, and their shared future had dwindled to the contents of a single cloth bundle. She had seen the way the townsfolk looked at her, the suspicion and contempt that followed her like a shadow. Here in this man's cold stare she saw something different. Not malice, but a familiar emptiness. Caleb's proposition was as blunt and unadorned as the man himself. It was not an offer of kindness, but a transaction of mutual desperation. "I need a housekeeper," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of warmth. He looked from her to the small office, as if the walls themselves were a witness to this bleak negotiation. "The agent says you're a hard worker." He would give her shelter, a roof to keep out the biting wind and the colder stares of the townsfolk. In return, she would work. "You will cook," he stated, his words like stones dropped into a well. "You will clean. You will earn your keep." His gaze shifted to Ann Lee, a tiny, silent girl with eyes as dark and watchful as her mother's. A flicker of something unreadable, perhaps hesitation, crossed his face. "The girl, she will not be a burden." There was no room for negotiation. There was only the abyss of starvation at her back and this man's cold, unyielding offer before her. Mai gave a single sharp nod. Her assent was not spoken, but conveyed in the straightness of her spine and the quiet dignity that had survived fires and floods and the loss of a world. This man was offering a cage, but outside its bars, the wolves were circling. A cage for now meant survival. The wagon ride to his ranch was a study in silence. The vast, empty landscape stretched on all sides, a canvas of bleached grass and endless sky that seemed to swallow the sound of the turning wheels. The fine red dust kicked up by the horses coated everything, a reminder that in this land, nothing stayed clean for long. Caleb did not speak. Mai did not speak. And Ann Lee huddled close to her mother, a tiny, silent witness to the contract that now bound their lives together. As they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view. It was stark and isolated, a collection of weathered buildings hunkered down against the vastness of the prairie. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out. Mai felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She was trading the town's open hostility for one man's private desolation. She did not know which was worse. As Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house, another figure emerged. A small girl with straw-colored hair and pale, vacant eyes stood on the porch watching their arrival, without a flicker of expression. This Mai knew must be his daughter. She looked as lost and lonely as the landscape itself. Mai began her work without a word. Her presence was a quiet intrusion, a slow, deliberate reclaiming of space. She moved with an economy of grace, her hands, though chapped and worn, seeming to understand the language of restoration. The house was a place frozen in time. Dust did not dare to settle, for there was no movement, no laughter, no life to stir it. The air was thin and sharp with the scent of pine soap and a deeper, more permanent sorrow. She started in the kitchen, scrubbing the floorboards, until the heart of the wood grain shone through a warm honey color against the gray light. She polished the windows until the harsh sunlight streamed in, unfiltered and unapologetic, chasing the long-held shadows from the corners. She mended Caleb's shirts, her stitches so fine, and even they were like whispers of care woven into the rough fabric. Slowly, miraculously, the house began to breathe again. The first true act of rebellion against the crushing silence was the scent of ginger and star anise. As Mai began to cook, the fragrant steam pushed back against the stale air, a fragrant tide against the shores of grief. She baked bread, and the warm, yeasty smell, the smell of life and sustenance, filled every room. Caleb would sit at his table, eating the food she prepared, and the taste of it was both foreign and deeply comforting. It was the taste of survival, of a life stubbornly continuing in the face of absolute loss. And it was a language his own silent heart was slowly, reluctantly beginning to understand. He watched her from a distance, his face set in a perpetual frown. This intrusion of life unsettled him. The home he had so carefully preserved as a shrine was being transformed, softened. He did not know if it was a violation or a salvation. Lee remained a shadow of her mother, a small watchful presence, with eyes that held the wisdom of an old soul. She did not play. She did not make a sound. She simply existed, a quiet testament to her mother's resilience. Her small hand often tucked into the folds of Mai's dark trousers as she worked. She and Rose orbited each other, like two shy planets, their silences overlapping but never touching. Rose would watch the newcomers from doorways, her expression a blank slate, a ghost in her own home. The first bridge was built not with words, but with a song. One afternoon, as Mai kneaded a heavy mound of dough, a melody escaped her lips, a soft, haunting lullaby from a life she had left behind. It was a tune of rice paddies and misty mountains, a sound as alien and as beautiful as a lotus blooming in the dust. Rose, who had been sitting in the corner with a faceless corn-husk doll, slowly stood up. She crept closer, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floorboards, drawn by the strange, sad beauty of the sound. Lee, seeing her approach, reached into her own small pocket and pulled out a treasure. It was a small bird, intricately carved from a single piece of scrap wood, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. She held it out to Rose, a silent offering. For a long moment, Rose simply stared at the gift. Her world had been devoid of such things for so long. Then her small, pale hand reached out and took it. Her fingers traced the smooth lines of the wood, a flicker of wonder in her vacant eyes. It was the first gift she had accepted, the first connection she had allowed in a year of impenetrable solitude. It was not a cure, but it was a crack in the ice. The true thaw began in the garden. Behind the house was a small patch of earth, hard and unforgiving. Sarah had tried to grow things there, but now it was choked with weeds. Mai worked it tirelessly, her fingers coaxing life from the stubborn soil. She planted seeds she had carried with her across the ocean, herbs for healing and vegetables for the pot. One day Rose followed her out and stood watching. She pointed a small, hesitant finger at a wild primrose growing defiantly by the fence. "How," Mai said softly, pointing to the flower. "Flower." Rose looked from the bloom to Mai's face, and then in a voice as rusty and fragile as an old hinge she whispered, "Flower." It was the first word she had spoken in 368 days. Mai froze, her heart catching in her throat. She looked at the small girl whose eyes for the first time held not a storm, but a quiet question. The sound of her own name spoken aloud after so long was a miracle. That evening, as Caleb sat staring into the fire, Rose approached him, the carved bird clutched in her hand. "Papa," she said, her voice still a thread of sound. He froze, his entire being focused on that one impossible word. He turned slowly, his heart a wild thing in his chest. "Papa," she repeated, her gaze drifting toward Mai, who was quietly clearing the table. "Why? Is her hair like black silk?" The question was simple, innocent, yet it shattered the frozen silence of the house. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of Mai, not as a function, not as a housekeeper, but as a person. Caleb had no answer. He could only look at the woman who had in a few short weeks coaxed both a flower from the dead earth and a word from his silent child. And for the first time in a very long year, he felt a flicker of something other than grief. It was a terrifying, unfamiliar warmth. It felt like hope. The weeks that followed saw a subtle but profound shift in the ranch's desolate atmosphere. The fragile bridges built by a song and a flower began to strengthen, woven together with the quiet threads of daily life. Yet the world outside the ranch's fences remained a threat, and the ghost of the man from the bank still haunted Caleb's waking thoughts. He made a trip into redemption, leaving Mai and the girls with a loaded rifle and strict instructions not to open the door to anyone. He found Sheriff Miller polishing a saddle in the livery. "Anything on the robbery?" Sheriff Caleb asked, keeping his voice level. Miller sighed, not looking up from his work. "Got a wire from the marshals in Fort Worth. A gang fitting the description hit a stagecoach near the Cimarron 2 weeks back. Led by a fellow they call Silas Kane. Educated, ruthless. Likes to work clean, but he's not afraid to leave a body behind." Silas Kane. Caleb repeated the name. It felt strange on his tongue. Did they say where he was from? No one knows. He's like a phantom. Appears, strikes, and vanishes. "What's your interest, Caleb? You get a look at him." "He took something of mine." Caleb said, his jaw tightening. "Something personal." "Let it go," the sheriff advised, finally looking up. His eyes were tired. "A man like Kane, he's not the kind you go looking for. You've got a daughter to think about. Go home." Caleb left the sheriff's office with a name but no answers. The feeling of powerlessness ate at him. He was a man used to solving problems with his hands with strength and will, but this enemy was a shadow he couldn't grasp. He began spending his evenings cleaning his Winchester until the metal gleamed, a ritual that did little to soothe the disquiet in his soul. Back at the ranch, a different kind of tension was building. Jed Harker, a neighboring rancher whose land bordered Caleb's, rode over one afternoon. He was a man whose opinions were as coarse as his hands, his face perpetually soured by suspicion. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the property, noting the laundry on the line and the strange, fragrant herbs growing in the garden before landing on Mai. A smirk twisted his lips. "Heard you took in one of them Celestials," Thorne Harker called out as Caleb emerged from the barn. "Bad luck, that is. They bring sickness, you know." His gaze lingered on Mai, a crude appraisal that made her flinch. She lowered her head, her hand stilling on a clothespin, making herself small. Caleb moved to stand between them, his body a solid, immovable wall. His voice when he spoke was low and cold, each word a chip of ice. "She is under my protection, Harker." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet menace in his tone was more potent than any shout. "You will show respect on my land, in my home." It was a simple declaration, but it was the first time he had claimed her as something more than an employee. He had drawn a line in the dust, not just around his property, but around her. Harker, taken aback by the cold fury in Caleb's eyes, could only grunt and remount his horse, casting one last resentful glare before riding away. Mai watched him go, then looked at Caleb, her expression unreadable. He had defended her honor. He had called his house her home. That night, as Mai was cleaning out an old trunk in the attic to make space, her fingers brushed against a small leather-bound journal. It was Sarah's. Hesitantly, she opened it. Most of the entries were about the ranch, the wildflowers, her hopes for the future, but one entry near the end made Mai's breath catch. October 12th. Another letter to Silas returned unopened. "My brother is as stubborn as Papa was. He cannot forgive me for choosing this life, for choosing Caleb. He thinks this land is a prison. Sometimes I fear he's right. Caleb works so hard he doesn't see how lonely it is. I pray one day Silas will meet him and understand. I pray he will come home. Silas." The name struck Mai like a physical blow. It had to be a coincidence. But the cold dread that settled in her stomach told her otherwise. She closed the journal, her mind racing. Who was this estranged brother, and what had happened to make him hate this place, and the man who lived here so much? She said nothing to Caleb, tucking the dangerous knowledge away, a secret she now carried alongside her own. The world outside shrank to the size of the storm. A blizzard descended from the north, a roaring beast of wind and snow that clawed at the walls of the ranch house and screamed down the chimney. It was a physical manifestation of the isolation that had defined Caleb's life. But now he was not alone in it. The house, once a cold tomb, was now a small, fragile vessel adrift in a sea of white. For days they were suspended in time, the rhythms of their lives dictated by the fury of the storm. The pressure inside the small home mounted the unspoken tensions and fragile hopes trapped together in the charged air. And then sickness, an old and dreaded enemy, crept in under the door. Rose began to burn with a fever. It started as a faint flush on her cheeks, but by the second night of the storm, she was delirious. Her small body racked with tremors. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Caleb's heart. It was a familiar terror, a ghost from his past rising to claim his future. He saw his wife Sarah, her face pale against the pillows, her breath growing shallow as a fever just like this one consumed her. He had been helpless then, and he was helpless now. The doctor was in redemption, a day's ride in good weather, an eternity away in the grip of the blizzard. As Caleb stood frozen by the ghosts of his past, Mai moved with a quiet, resolute purpose. The fear that paralyzed him seemed only to sharpen her focus. She became a healer, a guardian. She gently pushed Caleb aside and took command of the sick room. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark she had gathered and dried, forcing the cooling liquid between Rose's cracked lips. She steeped cloths in cold water and laid them on the child's burning forehead. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not sleep. She was a sentinel, her vigil fueled by a fierce protective tenderness that astonished Caleb. He watched this small foreign woman and saw not a servant, but a mother fighting for a child. On the 3rd night, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked and the house groaned under the weight of the snow. Rose's breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the roaring silence. Caleb retreated to the main room and sank into a chair by the hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both intimate and immense. Mai emerged from the bedroom, her face etched with exhaustion. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds, the crackle of the logs and the howling of the wind. I lost her mother the same way, Caleb said, his voice raw, torn from a place deep inside him. The words once spoken hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. A fever came on fast. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. I just watched her fade. He spoke of Sarah, of her laughter, of the guilt that had been his constant companion, the feeling that he should have been able to do more. Mai listened, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he fell silent, she spoke in her quiet, halting English. She told him of her husband, a scholar and a poet, killed in a tunnel collapse. She spoke of their first child, a daughter taken by cholera on the journey east. "We are the same," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We carry our ghosts." In that moment, by the dying fire, trapped by the storm, they were no longer a rancher and his hired help. They were 2 survivors, their hearts speaking the common, brutal language of loss. The long winter of their solitude had begun to thaw. While Caleb slept fitfully in his chair, Mai went to find a warmer blanket. In the chest where Sarah's things were kept beneath a stack of quilts, her hand found a small wooden box. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to Silas Kane in Sarah's elegant script. Most were sealed, but one was open unsent, Mai's hands trembled as she unfolded it. My dearest Silas. The letter began. Caleb is away again trying to sell the last of the herd. He worries so about the doctor's bills. I told him not to go, but he is determined to give this child everything. I am so tired, brother, and so frightened. The doctor in Redemption says the baby is not turned right. He talks of risks. I wish you were here. I wish you could forgive me and him. He is a good man, just lost in this land. Please come home. Your loving sister, Sarah. Mai's heart pounded. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying certainty. Silas Kane, the bank robber, was Sarah's brother. The man who held the locket, who knew Caleb's name, was family. And he was consumed by a grief that had curdled into vengeance. She folded the letter, the paper cool against her skin, a chilling premonition of the danger that lay waiting for them just beyond the storm. The blizzard broke at dawn on the 5th day, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean, blanketed in a pristine, blinding white. Inside the house, another storm had passed. Rose's fever was gone. She was weak, but her eyes were clear. She was alive. When she woke, the first person she asked for was not her father. Her gaze sought out the weary woman who had sat by her side, and a tiny, weak hand reached for Mai's. The atmosphere in the house was irrevocably altered. A fragile, unspoken intimacy had taken root. But the world outside and the knowledge Mai now held could not be kept at bay forever. When the roads were clear enough to travel, Caleb knew he had to go for supplies. Without discussion, it was understood that Mai and the two girls would go with him. The wagon felt less like a necessity and more like a family carriage. Rose and Ann Lee sat close together in the back. Their small hands linked their silent friendship, a world unto itself. As they drove down the main street of Redemption, the town's reaction was immediate and palpable. Curtains parted. Conversations ceased. Stares followed them like biting flies, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. The whispers were a venomous rustle in the air. At the general store, the feeling intensified. Jed Harker was there, leaning against the counter with two of his cronies, emboldened by their company. He saw them enter, and a malicious grin spread across his face. He pushed himself off the counter and swaggered toward them, blocking their path. "Well, look what the thaw washed in," he drawled, his eyes fixing on Mai with a lewd familiarity. "Still enjoying your imported comforts, Thorne." Before Caleb could move, Mai straightened her shoulders. She met Harker's gaze directly, her small frame radiating a dignity that seemed to make the air around her shimmer. She did not speak, but her silence was a rebuke. It was Caleb who delivered the decisive blow. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely in front of Mai and the children, a human shield. He ignored Harker completely, his gaze sweeping over the other men in the store, implicating all of them in his judgment. His voice when he spoke was not a low growl. It was clear and strong, ringing with a conviction no one had heard from him in years. "This woman," he said, his words dropping like stones into the sudden silence, "saved my daughter's life. While this town whispered behind its curtains, she fought for her. She has brought more honor and decency to my home than any of you have ever known." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he turned his back on the town, on their judgment, and he faced Mai. In front of everyone, he laid his heart bare. "Your daughter needs a home," he said, his voice softening, becoming a private conversation in a public space. "My daughter wants a mother." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a truth forged in sickness and silence. "Mai, I am asking you to be my wife." The store fell utterly silent. Mai looked up at this man of granite, who had just cracked open to reveal the vein of gold within. She saw the truth of his words, reflected in Rose's wide, hopeful eyes, and in the way her own Anne Lee clung to Rose's hand. This was not about pity or protection. It was about creation. It was about building a new family from the broken pieces of their old ones. She looked at Caleb Thorne, a man who had offered her a wage, and was now offering her his name, his future, his heart. And with the entire town of Redemption as her witness, she gave a single, deliberate nod. A violent thunderstorm crashed down on the plains, a furious echo of the turmoil that was about to break over the Thorne ranch. Rain lashed against the house in wind-driven sheets, and lightning ripped across the black sky, briefly illuminating a lone rider approaching the barn. Inside the house, the newly formed family was a small island of warmth against the storm. Rose and Anne Lee were asleep, their breaths mingling in the quiet room they now shared. Mai was mending one of Caleb's shirts by the firelight, while Caleb himself stood by the window, watching the tempest, a familiar disquiet settling over him. A sudden frantic whinny from the barn cut through the howl of the wind. Caleb's head snapped up. "Stay here," he said to Mai, his voice tight. He grabbed his Winchester from its rack by the door and shrugged on a heavy slicker. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand as he stepped outside. Bent against the gale, he fought his way toward the barn, and the lantern in his hand, casting a weak, dancing circle of light. The large barn doors, usually barred, were slightly ajar. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, raising the lantern. The first thing he saw were the girls. Rose and Anne Lee were huddled together in the center of the floor, their eyes wide with terror. Standing over them, his back to the door, was a tall figure. The man turned slowly, and the lantern light fell on his face. It was the bank robber, Silas Kane. He was holding Sarah's silver locket in one hand and a Colt revolver in the other. "Hello, Thorne," Silas said, his voice calm and chilling. "I'm sorry to intrude. We have some family business to discuss." He gestured with the revolver toward a small table where a piece of paper and a pen lay. It was the deed to the ranch. "Sign it." "Let the girls go," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He kept the Winchester pointed at the floor, knowing a single shot could endanger the children. "All in good time." Silas replied, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "First, I want what's mine. This land. It should have been hers. She died because of this place. Because you cared more about this worthless dirt than you did about her. You're her brother." Caleb breathed, the pieces finally snapping into place. "I am Silas," said his voice cracking with a sudden raw grief. "And I blame you for her death. You with your obsession, your pride. You let her waste away out here. You neglected her. So now I'm going to take the one thing you have left, just as you took my sister from me." As Silas spoke, a movement in the hayloft caught Caleb's eye. It was Mai. She must have followed him. She held up a hand, silently pleading with him to wait, then pointed toward a bundle of dried peppers and herbs hanging from a raft. Resourcefulness. Caleb held Silas's gaze, trying to buy her time. "You don't know what you're talking about?" Caleb said, taking a deliberate step forward. "You weren't here." "I should have been," Silas roared, his composure breaking. "She wrote to me, begged me to come home, but I was too proud, too angry. And while I was gone, you killed her. She didn't die from a fever." "Silas," Caleb said, his voice thick with a pain he had held silent for years. The storm outside rattled the barn doors, the ticking of Silas's pocket watch on the table a frantic countdown. "That's what I told the town. It's what I told myself. But it was a lie. High above Mai had managed to light a small bundle of the herbs with a match from her pocket. The pungent, stinging smoke began to drift down. Caleb's confession tumbled out a torrent of guilt and sorrow held back for too long. Sarah. We were going to have another child. A son. But there were complications. The baby wouldn't turn. The doctor here couldn't help. I rode out to sell the last of our cattle to get enough money to bring a specialist from Austin. She begged me not to go. She was scared. But I didn't listen. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could save them. His voice broke. When I got back, it was too late. I lost them both, Silas, my wife, my son, my neglect. It was me trying to save her. And I failed. I've lived with that failure every single day. Silas stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. His righteous quest for revenge, the single purpose that had driven him for a year, was built on a foundation of lies. The truth shattered him. At that moment, Mai dropped the smoking bundle. It landed in the hay near Silas's feet, erupting in a cloud of acrid, blinding smoke. Silas choked his eyes, streaming momentarily disoriented. It was the opening Caleb needed. He lunged not for his rifle, but for the girls, sweeping them into his arms and shielding them with his body. Silas, blinded by smoke and his own shattered grief, fired a single wild shot that splintered a roof beam. Caleb charged toward the door, bursting out into the raging storm as the sound of Silas's broken sobs echoed behind them in the smoke-filled barn. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and smelling of wet earth. Sheriff Miller and his deputy had come and gone, taking a subdued and broken Silas Kane with them. There would be a trial in Austin, but for the ranch on the edge of redemption, the siege was over. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence now, the silence of exhaustion and relief. A few days later, Caleb walked alone to the small fenced-off plot on a low hill overlooking the ranch. 2 wooden markers stood there, weathered by the sun and rain. One read, "Sarah Thorne, beloved wife." The other, smaller one, was blank. He knelt, tracing the letters of her name with his calloused finger. For the first time, he spoke to her not in his mind, but allowed the words carried away on the gentle breeze. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. I'm sorry I hid from it. From you." He told her about the children, about Mai, about the life that was blooming in the ruins of their old one. He talked until the sun began to dip below the horizon, and as he spoke, he felt the granite weight of his guilt and the weight he had carried for so long begin to lift. He was finally forgiving himself. The following week, he rode into town to see Silas one last time before the marshals transferred him. He found him in a small, dark cell staring at the wall. The cold intelligence was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, bottomless grief. Caleb slid the silver locket through the bars. "She would have wanted you to have it," Caleb said quietly. Silas picked it up, his hand trembling as he opened it, and looked at his sister's smiling face. "She wrote to me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I never opened her letters." "I know," Caleb said. "She loved you. She never stopped hoping you'd come home." There was no forgiveness exchanged between them. None was possible. But in the dim light of the cell, for a brief, somber moment, they were not enemies. They were just 2 men bound by the shared tragic loss of a woman they had both loved and both failed in their own way. Months later, the land had healed. The spring rains had been kind, and the creek now gurgled with life. Mai's garden was a riot of color, a vibrant, defiant testament to life's persistence. Corn grew tall, and the scent of herbs mingled with the sweet smell of clover. A new season had begun. One warm evening, the family worked together, pulling the last of the weeds before supper. Rose and Ann Lee, their voices a cheerful mix of English and Mandarin, chattered as they collected ladybugs in a jar. Their laughter was the ranch's new music. Caleb watched Mai as she gently tied a tomato vine to a stake, her movements full of a patient grace that had rebuilt his world. Later, as twilight settled over the plains, they gathered on the porch. Caleb went inside and returned a moment later. He was holding two objects in his hand. One was the small wooden bird that Ann Lee had carved, the gift that had first broken Rose's silence. The other was a new silver locket, a perfect copy of the one he had given away. Inside, however, were two pictures. On one side was Sarah's smiling face. On the other was a newer photo, a portrait of Mai, Rose, and Ann Lee, their heads close together, a study in quiet joy. He walked to the mantelpiece, cleared a space, and set Ann Lee's carved bird down. Next to it, he placed the new locket, standing it upright, so both pictures were visible. It was not a replacement of the past, but an inclusion of it. A merging of two stories, two families, into one. This was not a home he had defended, but one they had all built together from the broken pieces of their lives. Mai came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. Their fingers laced together, a perfect, comfortable fit. He looked at the mantelpiece, at the old memories and the new, and then at the family he had been given. He had offered a transaction of desperation and had received a gift of immeasurable grace. He had been the one who was lost, a ghost, adrift in a wilderness of his own making. Mai and the two small girls who now played in the gathering dusk had been the light that guided him home. The ice in his soul had not just thawed. It had become a river, carving a new and unexpected path, flowing steadily and surely toward a vast and welcoming sea.